Let's talk about an IAM permissions boundary. Let's begin with an example. Let's say you are an IAM admin for your organization and your organization has hired a developer. She's a Lambda developer. So her job is to write Lambda functions. In order to provide her the required permissions, you've attached a policy to her user profile. The policy has two permissions. The first permission is all actions on Lambda. So that means she can create and execute Lambda functions. But remember, Lambda functions may access other resources. For example, if you write a Lambda function to start and stop EC2 instances, the Lambda function needs to have the permissions to access EC2. And to do that, the developer will have to pass a role to Lambda. So you've attached the IAM pass role permissions. This allows her to pass a role with the required permissions to Lambda, so Lambda can then access the required service. The Lambda developer writes her first Lambda function, which is to read some data from an S3 bucket. So she needs get permissions and list permissions on the S3 service. Now, the policy that's attached to her user profile does not allow her to create new IAM roles. It only allows her to pass a role to the Lambda function. So she can't create a role. So she comes to you and says, can you create an IAM role for me? You create the IAM role with the required permissions, and it's called S3 read access. Now the developer is able to pass the role to the Lambda function so it can access the S3 service. Then the developer writes a new Lambda function that needs to access the EC2 service. So she needs describe permissions and get permissions on the EC2 service. She can't create the role, so she comes to you and says, can you create an IAM role? You create the IAM role called EC2 read access. She can pass the role over to Lambda and she can execute the function. You see the problem here. Every time she has to create an IAM role, she has to approach the IAM admin. If you are a small-sized organization, this could be manageable. But imagine an organization where you have lots of developers. And every time a developer needs to create a new IAM role, they have to approach you. So this is not a scalable solution. So you decide, well, we are going to give the developer the permissions required to create the IAM role. So you change her permissions to make it look like this. The first two permissions are the same, full access on Lambda and IAM pass role, but along with that, you are also giving her some permissions on the IAM service. You're allowing her to create a policy, create a role, update a role, attach a policy to the role, get permissions, and list permissions. The developer is now happy because she does not have to come to you to get the IAM role created. But this approach has a problem. Since you've given her the IAM create role and attach role policy permissions, she can now attach any policy to a Lambda function, even administrator access. So now she can attach a policy that has administrator access to the Lambda function. And now she can not only access S3 and EC2 services, she can access a bunch of other services because the policy that she's attached is an administrator access policy. So she can now access database services, CloudWatch services, EC2, VPC, email services, and a bunch of other services as well. So how do we solve this without having the developer come back to us to create the IAM role? So to fix this problem, you require the developer to attach a boundary policy every time she creates a new role. The permissions on the left are the same, but now you require her to attach a boundary policy. A boundary policy is just like any other policy, but it is used to define the maximum permissions. A boundary policy by itself does not provide any permissions. However, it defines the maximum permissions that you can get. So now she can attach any policy of her choice, but the boundary policy will restrict it to get and list access on S3 and get and describe access on EC2. Having understood this, let's now get to the console. I'm here at the IAM console. Let's recreate the scenario. So I'll start by navigating to Policies, I'll click on create policy and we'll create a new policy for the developer. So the first service that the developer needs access to is Lambda. We're providing full permissions on all resources. So this will allow the developer to create and execute Lambda functions. And we also need to provide permissions on IAM because the developer needs to be able to see what roles are available, and he should also be able to pass the role to the Lambda function. So we are providing the list roles permission, and we are also providing the pass role permission on all resources. So this is what the policy looks like. Full permissions on Lambda, you're allowed to list the roles, and you're also allowed to pass the role. Let's click on review policy. We'll give it a name. Let's call it as developer policy. And I'll click on create policy. Now the policy is created. We'll attach it to the user. So here's the user, add permissions, attach existing policies, and we'll attach the policy that we just created, developer policy. Add permissions, and that's done. Now I'll switch to another window where I'm already logged in as this user. So here I'm logged in as the user, and when I try to access the Lambda service, I should be able to access everything within Lambda because I have full permissions on Lambda. And when I try to create a new function, you will notice that after you provide the function name, you have the option here to attach an IAM role. The user has two permissions, list roles and pass roles. So I should be able to view any existing IAM roles. Now, I don't see any roles here right now because there is no role in my account for the Lambda service. So let's quickly create one. Back over here as the IAM administrator, I'm going to quickly create a role and click on create role. This role will be used by the Lambda service. All right. And we are going to provide permissions on the EC2 service. So let's say Amazon EC2 read-only access. I'll click on next. We're not providing tags for now. Next review, and let's say Lambda role for EC2. Now we'll switch back to the other window, and if I do a refresh here, the user should be able to see that role. So the user is able to use existing roles to create a new Lambda function. If the user needs a new role for the Lambda function, he'll need to approach the IAM administrator. The role will be created by the administrator and he can use it here. As we discussed earlier, this can be a problem when you have a large organization. Every time the developer will need to approach the IAM admin to get the role created. To solve this problem, we've decided to provide more permissions to the developer so they can create the required roles and use it for the Lambda functions. So let's do that. Back over here, we're going to modify the policy that's attached to that user, which is called as the developer policy. And we'll click on edit policy. We'll start with IAM. I'll click on actions here. So we'll provide permissions to create a new policy, create a new role. We'll also provide permissions to update the role. And we'll go to permissions management. We'll also provide permissions to attach the policy to the role. We need to provide this permission as well, create policy. All right, so now if we look at the JSON here, we can see that this allows you to create a policy, this allows you to create a role, it allows you to update the role, it allows you to attach the policy to the role. Now let's change this to list star. That will provide all list permissions. And let's also add one more permission here, get star, so all get permissions are provided as well. All right, so with this policy, the developer should have all the access needed to create a policy and attach the policy to a role and then use the role with the Lambda function. I'll click on save changes. So this is now completed. So let's go back to the other window where we are logged in as the developer. So now the developer has all the permissions. So the developer says, okay, I need to create a new role for my Lambda function, And to do that, I'm going to navigate to IAM. And he creates a new role for the Lambda service. Next, permissions. Now this is where the problem starts. Since we've not specified any restrictions, the developer can also attach this policy, administrator access. Let's call this as demo role for EC2, just as a placeholder. Okay, remember, it provides administrator access, not just on EC2, but across any AWS service. I'll click on create role. And now when I go back to Lambda as the developer, and I try to create a new function, you notice here, the developer can use that role. And this role is not just providing permissions on EC2, but across any AWS service. Now that we understand the problem, let's see how to fix this by configuring a boundary policy. Back to this window where I'm logged in as the IAM administrator, we'll start by creating a new policy which will be used as the boundary policy. We are not going to change the existing policy right now. We'll first configure the boundary policy and then we'll come back to this policy. So I'll click on create policy. The boundary policy is used to define the maximum permissions. And right now, the developer only needs read permissions on EC2 and S3. So we'll start by selecting the EC2 service and we'll provide describe permissions. You can select any describe permission. We'll change that later on. And we'll also provide get permissions. All right. And then when we go to the JSON here, we can simply change that to describe all and get all. Similarly, we'll also provide permissions on S3. Okay, and we're going to provide get permissions and list permissions. This requires you to provide a resource, so I'm going to set that to all resources. And now when I go back to the JSON here, we can change that to list all and get all. So we've defined a policy that provides read level permissions on EC2 and S3. Let's review the policy and give it a name. We'll call this as boundary policy. Create policy. All right, so the boundary policy is created. If we go back to users here and look at the user's profile, this is the policy that's attached to the user. So we need to modify this policy. So I'll click on policies here. I'll filter by customer managed and click on the developer policy. I'll edit the policy. And here's what we're going to do. So we're going to remove these two permissions over here. We're going to remove the attach role policy permission. And we are also going to remove the create role policy. We're going to define that. We're going to define that in a separate policy statement. So I'm going to say add additional permissions on the IAM service. Okay. And we're going to provide the same permissions, create role, okay, and attach role policy. But this will have a requirement. So when you try to create a new role and when you try to attach a policy to a role, you need to provide a boundary, right? So we're going to say all resources. That's fine. This is what we're going to use, request conditions. So we're going to say add condition. All right. And we're going to say you need to provide an IAM permissions boundary where the string equals, and we need to provide the ARN of the boundary policy that we created. I just realized we haven't copied that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back here from the other console where we logged in as the developer, and we'll copy it from here. So if I go back to policies here, I should be able to view the policies. I should have copied it earlier when I was configuring from the IAM administrator window, but that's okay. We can copy it from here. So this is the ARN, and I switch back over here and provide that boundary policy. All right, now let's look at this in JSON. So here we have the policy. Now these are the unchanged parts. Okay, so you have full permissions on Lambda. You have all get access, all list access. You can create a policy if you want. You can update the role. Okay, but when you try to create a new role, or when you try to attach a policy to a role, there is a requirement. You need to attach a boundary policy, and this is the boundary policy that you must attach. All right, so let's see how this works. I'll click on review policy, save changes. All right, and we'll go back to the other window where we're logged in as the developer, and let's see what happens if you try to create a new role. So create a new role for the Lambda service, and we'll do the same thing again. We'll try to attach administrator access because, hey, we have permissions, right? So let's try to attach the administrator access policy here, and I'll click on next review. Let's give this a name. Let's call this as Lambda policy for EC2 and S3. I'm just making up a name here, S3, and we've attached administrator access here, and let's try to create that role, and straight away it says you're not allowed to do this, and that's because we haven't attached the boundary policy. So we'll go back here and we'll say set permissions boundary, use a permission boundary, and we'll attach the permissions boundary policy. And now when we try to create a role, you're able to do it. So the developer is able to create a new role only when he attaches a boundary policy. And the boundary policy will limit the effective permissions that is available. It will only provide read level access on EC2 and S3.